Dear all, I would like to read the detailed presentation that I have prepared on boosting India Australia economic cooperation. In a recent speech, Prime Minister Morrison of Australia termed the Indo Pacific as the world's strategic center of gravity. And the emerging realities of the Indo Pacific region require India and Australia as two democracies, which are also partners in the Quad, to work closer together. In his opening remarks at the Australia India bilateral summit held last year, Prime Minister Narendra Modi referred to the shared values, shared interests, shared geography, and shared objectives of the two countries, and observed, and I quote, I believe that this is the perfect time, the perfect opportunity to further strengthen the relations between India and Australia. Now, if you look at the political and security aspects of cooperation between the two countries, they have seen steady growth in recent years. High-level visits, joint military exercises, and the dialogue mechanisms have given them impetus. But the economic dimension remains underexploited. A look at the trade and investment numbers suggests that bilateral trade in goods, services, and cross-border investment have seen reasonable growth considering the depressed global economic circumstances that prevailed much of the last decade. But they could have been far more dynamic, particularly considering the potential. Now, for Australia, India is the third or fourth largest export partner, accounting for over 5% of Australia's exports. And India is the second largest destination for Australia's education services exports. But India's rank is far lower in Australia's imports, with a share of around 2% or so. Similar disparities exist in services trade as well, which is also in Australia's favor. However, the growth rates in services are significantly better than in goods and in both directions. The question for the two countries, which are at different levels of development, is whether they can work out a framework for trade and economic cooperation that can accommodate each other's interests and aspirations and also cater to the compelling needs of the Indo-Pacific today. The leaderships of the two countries have already decided to move towards a comprehensive strategic partnership. If you had heard the two prime ministers speaking at the Bengaluru Tech Summit and the Sydney Dialogue in the last few days, their call for greater cooperation, including on advanced technologies, critical minerals, and other areas, were loud and clear. At their virtual summit last year on June 4, they had also decided to re-engage on concluding the bilateral free trade agreement named SEPA, Comprehensive Economic Partnership Agreement, taking into account earlier bilateral discussions. If indeed SEPA can get concluded in good time, it can certainly energize and enlarge bilateral merchandise and services trade. It could also provide a strong framework for strengthening economic cooperation. Indeed, the two sides already know each other's red lines and sensitivities. SEPA negotiations have been held over several rounds between May 2011 and September 2015. These issues would have also figured in some manner during the RCEP negotiations until India withdrew from the process in November 2019. Of course, RCEP was a regional agreement involving far many more partners. But that still allowed the two countries to have an understanding of each other's sensitivities as they evolved over the years. So the key is for the two countries to craft a deal that can work around those sensitivities and provide adequate flexibilities to effectively address them. Now, this approach, I believe, was hinted at when the previous Australian Trade Minister, Simon Birmingham, visited New Delhi in March this year. I must, however, mention that in India, a perception has gained ground that its existing FTAs have not brought commensurate benefits. This is a reality. And in trying to conclude future FTAs, the Government of India will therefore be under some pressure. In any new FTA, it will have to demonstrate that India's own access to the partners' market will not remain unrealized due to non-tariff barriers or protective visa provisions and standards, or because mutual recognition negotiations on professional competence and qualifications cannot make progress. Now, moving forward with the SEPA negotiations, I believe, will also require taking a medium to longer term perspective. The ambitious India strategy recommended by former High Commissioner Peter Verghese, the former Australian High Commissioner to India, looked at such a framework up to 2035. But of course, this report was mainly devoted to how Australia should go about this. The recommendations in the report also had a wider scope than just SEPA. But what I wish to underline is that an approach to SEPA that can work as a ladder for development for India has a better chance of success. It is evident from Mr. Verghese's report that Australia is well aware of the sensitivities for India in agriculture. Farming in India covers a large population and is mostly of the subsistence kind, rather than being run substantially on a commercial scale. The sector does need reform, even as these are politically sensitive. That is still an issue in progress. If India's realities in this sector are better understood and accommodated, and FTAs are framed in a manner to be supportive of reform without carrying the potential for depriving livelihoods, some forward movement can be expected. Now, product standards and phytosanitary measures form another key issue, both in terms of access to the Australian market for some of India's agricultural and other products, and to Australia's products in India. Here again, if there can be greater cooperation, including technical cooperation, in being able to make progress on equivalence or mutual recognition arrangements, along with a degree of reciprocity in the enhancement of market access, perhaps it will incentivize progress on SEPA. On services, there is a fair degree of complementarity. India is already a significant consumer of Australia's education services, which may only grow. In fact, education services accounted for around 73% of Australia's total export of services to India in 2014-15, but these have gone up to account for 83% by 2018-19. And Australia's overall services exports to India has more than doubled during these 4-5 years. Of course, during the COVID time, I think they have seen a dip, but I take it that these will get revived very soon. Now, if India's IT and IT-enabled services exports can also build further on present growth trends, this could provide another basis for infusing favorable momentum. Australia is a net importer of skilled manpower. Here again, India could serve as a steady source. Greater professionalism could be imparted to manpower availability if investments can be made through bilateral cooperation on skilling, technical training, and certification. Now, if you come to non agricultural products, considering that mutual sensitivities may be relatively lower, it should be possible to move forward more quickly. Australia is a substantial supplier of coal, iron ore, alumina, wool, cotton, and gold, which go on to meet India's needs. Even the imports of steel and aluminium are mainly of scrap used for recycling in India. Australia's interest will, of course, be to improve access for its other manufactured products through lower Indian tariffs. Some of its competitors from Korea, Japan, and ASEAN countries already enjoy such access through prevailing FTAs with India. Now, if you look at India's exports to Australia of these non agricultural goods, they have not shown a very steady pattern, largely because of the predominance of exports of India's refined petroleum products in their basket, which has kind of fluctuated depending on prices and demand. But certain products such as pharmaceuticals, machinery, leather goods, garments, and textiles have seen a steadier rise. A few items like railway coaches, steel tubes, and passenger vehicles have shown spurts in certain years but have not maintained a steady trend. It is, however, interesting that during the COVID times, bilateral trade in goods has held reasonably well in both directions, including so far in the current financial year. Now, it's relevant to note here that Australia has entered into several FTAs in the last few years, including regional ones, with countries which are India's competitors for some of these products in the Australian market. The average preferential tariff in Australia in 2019 for non-agricultural products was 0.2% for ASEAN countries and zero for or close to zero for China, Japan, and Republic of Korea. On the other hand, the average tariff was 2.5% for India's non-agricultural products. An FTA could therefore make a vital difference, particularly for products like garments or textiles on which applicable tariffs are much higher. India's generics are well accepted worldwide, and pharmaceuticals form a principal item of export to Australia also, and they accounted for over US dollars 250 million in 2019-20. That went up to US dollars 317 million last year during the COVID year. But the potential, again, I believe, is far more. Greater linkages with Australia's pharma procurement process and approval process can help. To the extent the FTA is seen as bringing additionality to these and other promising sectors, it will make progress easier for India. The trade ministers of Australia, Japan, and India have talked about developing a supply chain resilience program. Separately, in India, the government has launched a production linked incentive scheme, whose objective, among others, is to build competitive manufacturing locally and make India a part of global supply chains. Now, these PLI schemes now cover several areas: electronics, automobiles and components, pharmaceutical drugs and APIs, medical devices, solar modules, advanced chemical cell batteries, white goods, textiles, food products, phones, and other telecom products, and specialty steel. In fact, in the area of textile, some textile parks are also being set up. Foreign investments in technology is being welcomed and incentivized in these areas. The Trilateral Supply Chain Resilience Initiative with Japan and Australia can well plug into the PLI scheme in India through investments in these various sectors. Here again, for the supply chain to work well, a bilateral FTA could make it more attractive for investors. Moving together on both PLI scheme and FTA fronts could therefore prove helpful. A former Indian High Commissioner to Australia had observed that while official Canberra sees the opportunity in India, private Australian business groups have been somewhat shy to grab it. Now, certainly, this requires serious efforts, not only towards concluding an FTA, but the launch of parallel investment initiatives, which could perhaps change the outlook. It was most encouraging to hear both Prime Minister Modi and PM Morrison talk about cooperation in the areas of critical and emerging technologies, critical minerals, and digital economy, etc., in their addresses to the Bengaluru IT Summit and the Sydney Dialogue. Joint workshops on some of these issues and initiatives to set up a new Australia-India Centre for Excellence for Critical and Emerging Technology Policy, which are in the works, can hugely contribute. At a time when the world is moving towards greater electrification of vehicles, clean energy technologies, quantum computing, and artificial intelligence that requires several critical minerals, closer cooperation among trusted partners is essential. One author who has been writing on critical minerals cooperation between our two countries has even gone to the extent of suggesting an FTA between the two countries just on critical minerals. One aspect that has been a handicap for India in forging greater economic cooperation with the region is its absence from Apec. While Apec brought together its members on trade and investment issues through its various initiatives and activities, its signature contribution, I believe, stood out on trade facilitation. Through its Trade Facilitation Action Program between 2001 and 2006, it significantly brought down transaction costs in its member countries by 5%. Spurred by its success, APEC also adopted a successor Trade Facilitation Action Plan 2, which took this process even further. This was no doubt a very technical exercise with cost measurements at each stage and steps suggested on how the time and cost in each identified aspect could be reduced or minimized. Now, all this was done not through coercive measures, but through peer pressure and making available the best practices for emulation. Now, India, unfortunately, was not part of this exercise and could certainly gain from the APEC experience on the subject, perhaps even through the Trilateral Supply Chain Resilience Initiative. We do not know if APEC enjoys the same level of traction today. But that initiative from the Australian Prime Minister Bob Hawke in 1989 infused economic dynamism in the Asia-Pacific region. The Indo-Pacific region beckons such an initiative today. Finally, reverting back to the SEPA joint press statement that was issued between India's Commerce and Industry Minister Mr. Piyush Goyal and Australian Trade Minister Dan Tehan on 26 August this year. They have directed the officials from the two sides to speed up negotiations to achieve an early harvest interim agreement by December this year and pave the way for a comprehensive agreement. Now, an early harvest can be useful in propping up trade and investment environment in both the partner countries. The pandemic has affected business sentiment to varying degrees, and companies are looking for fresh opportunities to open up. The aggressive behavior shown by China, both across India's land borders and over its economic borders with Australia, has given this some urgency to both the latter countries and perhaps a common resolve. Such a quick interim agreement to be followed by a comprehensive deal can help economically underpin the emerging strategic convergence between these two Quad partners, particularly after India's withdrawal from the RCEP negotiations in 2019. Now, early harvest normally comprises providing limited but impactful market access benefits more immediately by each country to the other. This allows the businesses in the two countries to get a foretaste of favorable prospects of an eventual comprehensive agreement without having to wait for the complex process of negotiations to get completed on all the rules and other market access issues, some of which could be in the sensitive areas and may need time. If well done, an early harvest could also impart the necessary trust and mutual confidence for the two countries to subsequently address those sensitive issues in a mutually beneficial manner. An early harvest deal, however, should be well balanced by itself so that benefits accrue adequately to both sides and are also seen to be doing so. Secondly, it should still leave adequate appetite to persuade each side to quickly negotiate and conclude the remaining part and not leave matters for endless rounds or a weak eventual outcome. India has had some not so positive experiences in this regard. Political or industry opposition, once it gains momentum, can be difficult to contain or reverse. It would also be useful to know if an early harvest deal would also require legislative approval from the Australian Parliament. In the Indian case, this is not the situation. All these aspects will need to be kept in view. But ultimately, both sides will need to work for what is an equitably balanced and mutually beneficial final agreement as well. Thank you very much for your attention.